July 19th, 1944, a maintenance depot 12 miles behind the front lines near Saint-Lô, France. Technical Sergeant Frank Martinez of the 3rd Armored Division's Ordnance Company watches as a recovery crew tows in another knocked-out Soviet T-34 tank, captured by the Germans, then abandoned during their retreat 2 days earlier. The T-34 is a wreck. Its turret is blown off. The hull is scorched black from internal fires. But Martinez isn't looking at the tank itself. He's looking at what's scattered around it. Dozens of spent shell casings, each stamped with Cyrillic markings. Martinez picks one up. It's a 76.2mm armor-piercing round, heavier than comparable American shells. The projectile design is different too. A sharper nose, denser construction. He turns it over in his hands, studying the metallurgy. Behind him, Lieutenant James Becker approaches. "Sarge, we've got 3 more Shermans coming in from the 32nd Regiment. All 3 took hits from Panthers at under 800 yards. Frontal armor penetrated clean through." Martinez nods absently, still examining the Soviet shell. The 3rd Armored has lost 47 tanks in the past 2 weeks, most to German Panthers and Tigers, whose 75mm and 88mm guns can punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges where American 75mm guns are nearly useless. The kill ratio is brutal. For every German heavy tank destroyed, the Americans are losing 3 or 4 Shermans. "Lieutenant," Martinez says slowly, "what if we could make our rounds hit harder?" Becker looks at the Soviet shell casing. "That's Russian ammunition. We can if we figure out why it works better." What Martinez and a handful of other American tankers were about to discover, buried in Soviet metallurgy and German desperation, would fundamentally alter American tank ammunition design and save hundreds of crews in the battles to come. But first, they'd have to become scavengers. By the summer of 1944, American armor doctrine faced a crisis that threatened the entire northwestern European campaign. The M4 Sherman medium tank, the backbone of U.S. armored divisions, was being systematically outmatched by German heavy armor at precisely the moment when Allied forces needed armored superiority to break out of Normandy. The Sherman was never intended to fight other tanks as its primary mission. American doctrine, developed in the years before extensive combat experience, envisioned medium tanks as exploitation vehicles, breaking through infantry lines, disrupting supply routes, and supporting advancing infantry. Tank destroyers, not tanks, were supposed to handle enemy armor. But Normandy's hedgerow terrain and the unexpectedly heavy German armored resistance collapsed that distinction. Shermans were fighting Panthers and Tigers in direct engagements, and they were losing. The statistics were devastating. The M4A1 Sherman, armed with a 75mm M3 gun, could penetrate approximately 68mm of armor at 500 yards, using standard M61 armor-piercing rounds. The German Panther's frontal armor was 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of nearly 140mm. At combat ranges under 1,000 yards, American 75mm rounds simply bounced off. The reverse wasn't true. The Panther's 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun could penetrate 120mm of armor at 1,000 yards. The Sherman's frontal armor maxed out at 51mm. German gunners could kill Shermans from ranges where American tankers couldn't even damage them. The casualty figures reflected this imbalance. Between June 6th and July 24th, 1944, the U.S. First Army lost over 400 medium tanks in combat. Many crews burned to death in vehicles whose ammunition stowage ignited when penetrated, earning the Sherman its grim nickname among British crews, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter advertised as lighting every time. American tankers understood the problem intimately. After-action reports from the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions documented engagement after engagement where Sherman platoons ambushed German armor, scored multiple hits at close range, and watched their rounds ricochet harmlessly off Panther glacis plates. German tanks, meanwhile, destroyed Shermans with single shots. Major General Maurice Rose, commanding Combat Command A of the 3rd Armored Division, wrote in a July 15th report to 7 Corps headquarters, "Our tank guns are inadequate against German heavy armor at any range beyond point blank. Crews are increasingly reluctant to engage Panthers frontally. This is not a morale failure. It is a rational response to technological inferiority." The Army's solution was arriving, but slowly. The 76mm N-1 gun, with better armor penetration, was being mounted on new Sherman variants. But production and shipping delays meant most tanks in Normandy still carried the obsolete 75mm, and even the 76mm, while better, couldn't reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor beyond 600 yards. What made the situation particularly desperate was that American industry couldn't rapidly redesign tanks or guns. The Sherman production lines were optimized for the 75mm. Retooling would take months. New tank designs, like the M26 Pershing with its 90mm gun, wouldn't reach Europe until 1945. American tankers needed a solution now. Not next quarter, not next year. Now. The standard response was tactical. Don't fight German heavy armor frontally. Flank them. Use superior numbers. Call in air support. But in Normandy's confined terrain, flanking maneuvers were often impossible. Air support was grounded by weather, and superior numbers meant accepting casualty ratios that were bleeding American armored divisions faster than replacements could arrive. Ordnance officers and tank commanders began searching for any edge. They experimented with loading tactics, carrying more high-explosive rounds to disable tracks and optics. They tried improvised armor, welding extra plates and sandbags onto hulls. Some crews requested white phosphorus rounds to blind enemy gunners. But none of these addressed the fundamental problem. American armor-piercing ammunition wasn't hard enough, wasn't dense enough, and wasn't aerodynamic enough to defeat German heavy armor at tactically relevant ranges. The answer was scattered across the battlefields of France, stamped with Cyrillic letters and largely ignored, until a handful of maintenance sergeants and frustrated tankers started paying attention. German tankers didn't underestimate American armor because they were arrogant. They underestimated it because combat results confirmed their technical superiority. After-action reports from panzer units in July 1944 repeatedly noted that engaging Sherman platoons at ranges beyond 800 meters was almost without risk. German armor could systematically destroy American tanks while remaining effectively invulnerable to return fire. SS Hauptsturmführer Ernst Barkmann, commanding a Panther with Panzer Regiment II, wrote in his combat diary about an engagement near St. Lo where his single tank destroyed 6 Shermans in 11 minutes without taking damage. "The Americans show courage," he noted, "but their machines cannot match ours at distance. They must close to suicidal range to threaten us, and we kill them as they approach." This wasn't battlefield boasting. It was accurate tactical analysis. The metallurgical reality was that American M61 armor-piercing rounds used a relatively soft steel core that tended to shatter on impact with face-hardened German armor. The rounds were designed in the late 1930s, when the thickest tank armor anticipated was around 50-60 mm. They worked adequately against early Panzer IIIs and IVs. Against Panthers and Tigers, they were obsolete. American ordnance engineers knew this. Aberdeen Proving Ground had conducted tests as early as 1943 showing that M61 rounds had poor performance against sloped, hardened armor. But developing new ammunition required extensive metallurgical research, production retooling, and stockpile replacement, a process measured in years, not months. Meanwhile, American tank crews were dying in a knowledge vacuum. Most didn't understand why their rounds bounced off German armor. They assumed they were missing or hitting at bad angles, or that German armor was somehow impossibly thick. Training hadn't prepared them for an enemy with such overwhelming technical superiority in armor protection and gun performance. The psychological impact was corrosive. Tankers began avoiding engagements with Panthers and Tigers when possible. Some crews reported deliberately targeting German tanks' tracks or gun barrels, components they could damage, rather than attempting to penetrate armor. This was tactically sound but strategically disastrous. American doctrine depended on aggressive armored exploitation. Tankers who feared their own weapons' inadequacy couldn't execute that doctrine. What frustrated field officers most was that solutions existed elsewhere. British tankers were using specialized tungsten core armor-piercing rounds, APDS, or armor-piercing discarding sabot, with dramatically better penetration. But tungsten was scarce, and American production priorities hadn't shifted to these exotic rounds. The weapons were allocated primarily to tank destroyers, not medium tanks. Soviet tankers, fighting on the Eastern Front, faced the same German armor and somehow managed better outcomes. American intelligence officers noted that Soviet T-34s, mounting a similar caliber 76.2mm gun to the American 75mm, achieved higher kill ratios against Panthers than Shermans did. Something about Soviet ammunition or tactics was working, but nobody was systematically studying Soviet ordnance. The USSR was an ally, not a source of tactical intelligence for American tankers. Their ammunition was dismissed as Russian manufacture, adequate for their purposes, but not relevant to American needs. Then came the retreats of July 1944, when German forces abandoned equipment captured during earlier victories over Soviet units. And suddenly, Russian scrap was everywhere. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about World War II tank ammunition and armor penetration dynamics. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about American tankers scavenging Soviet ammunition before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II armored warfare. Hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The breakthrough began not in a laboratory, but in a salvage yard. Technical Sergeant Frank Martinez wasn't a metallurgist. He was a 28-year-old maintenance NCO from El Paso, Texas, who'd worked in his father's machine shop before the war. But he understood materials, and when he examined Soviet 76.2mm armor-piercing rounds recovered from abandoned T-34 tanks, he recognized that something about their construction was fundamentally different from American ammunition. The Soviet rounds were heavier. When Martinez weighed them against comparable American 75mm M61 rounds, the Soviet ammunition was approximately 15% denser. The projectiles themselves had a sharper ogive, the curved nose section, and when he carefully sectioned one using a workshop bandsaw, he discovered why. The core was different. American M61 rounds used a medium carbon steel penetrator surrounded by a mild steel outer shell. The Soviet rounds used a much harder steel alloy for the penetrator core. Later analysis would identify it as a chromium nickel steel, hardened to approximately Rockwell C40-45, significantly harder than American penetrators. The outer shell was softer, designed to strip away on impact and let the hard core punch through. Martinez brought his findings to Lieutenant Becker, who brought them to Captain Richard Earl, the 3rd Armored Division's ordnance officer. Earl was skeptical, but intrigued. "Even if the Soviet rounds are better," he said, "we can't exactly load them into our tanks. They're 76.2mm. Our guns are 75mm. They won't chamber." "No, sir," Martinez agreed, "but we could make our rounds the same way." Earl looked at the sectioned Soviet ammunition. You're talking about changing the metallurgy of our penetrators. That's not field modification. That's industrial retooling. What if we're not the first people to figure this out? Earl made calls. Within 2 days, he'd discovered that ordnance officers in at least 3 other armored divisions had made similar observations. The 2nd Armored Division had actually test-fired captured Soviet 76.2mm ammunition against knocked-out Panthers and confirmed that the Soviet rounds penetrated frontal armor at ranges where American 75mm rounds bounced off. The data reached 7th Corps headquarters, then 1st Army, then finally the European Theater Ordnance Technical Intelligence Unit at Valognes. By late July, Aberdeen Proving Ground received orders to conduct urgent metallurgical analysis of Soviet armor-piercing ammunition. But analysis would take weeks. American tanks were fighting now. What happened next was improvised, borderline insubordinate, and absolutely critical. Field ordnance units, operating with tacit approval from division commanders who officially knew nothing, began experimenting with modified ammunition, loading procedures, and alternative round selection. They couldn't change the metallurgy, but they could optimize what they had. Soviet tactical analysis, translated from captured German intelligence documents about Eastern Front engagements, revealed that Soviet tankers used different engagement tactics. They fired armor-piercing rounds at closer ranges than American doctrine recommended, and they aimed for specific weak points: turret rings, gun mantlets, lower glacis plates. More significantly, the Soviets used their high explosive rounds differently. Soviet HE rounds had heavier explosive fillers than American versions. When fired at heavily armored targets, these rounds couldn't penetrate, but the explosive force of a near miss or surface detonation could damage vision ports, external optics, tracks, and external components. A blinded Panther was almost as good as a destroyed one. American crews started adopting these tactics. Tank commanders in the 3rd Armored Division began training gunners to target specific weak points rather than simply aiming center mass at enemy armor. They carried more high-explosive rounds and used them to suppress and disable rather than destroy. The results appeared almost immediately. On July 25th, during Operation Cobra, the massive breakout from Normandy, Sherman crews from the 2nd Armored Division engaged a Panther platoon near Marigny. Instead of attempting frontal penetration at 1,000 yards, they closed to 400 yards using terrain cover, fired high explosive rounds at the Panther's turret faces to destroy optics and blind the crews, then maneuvered to flank positions and fired armor-piercing rounds into side armor. 3 Panthers destroyed. No Shermans lost. The engagement was studied by every division ordnance officer in the theater. What changed wasn't the ammunition itself. Not yet. What changed was how American tankers thought about their weapons. The 75mm gun couldn't out-penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at long range, but it could disable, suppress, and create opportunities for kills at close range and from angles. Meanwhile, Aberdeen Proving Ground's analysis of Soviet ammunition reached preliminary conclusions by early August. The metallurgical differences were confirmed. Soviet armor-piercing rounds used significantly harder steel cores that retained integrity on impact with face-hardened armor, where American rounds tended to shatter. The Soviet rounds also had superior ballistic coefficients. They retained velocity better at range, increasing impact energy. The Army issued urgent contracts for new armor-piercing ammunition designated M93, featuring hardened steel cores using chromium-nickel alloys similar to Soviet designs. But production wouldn't ramp up until late 1944. For tankers fighting in France in the summer of '44, the new ammunition might as well have been science fiction, except that some ordnance units, operating in gray areas of regulation and official oversight, began doing something unexpected. They started heat-treating existing M61 penetrators. Using Field Workshop's forge equipment, ordnance sergeants experimented with heating M61 penetrator cores to critical temperatures, then quenching them in oil to increase hardness. The process was crude. Quality control was non-existent. Many rounds probably cracked or became brittle, but some worked. Tests against abandoned German armor showed that heat-treated rounds penetrated approximately 15–20% better than standard M61 ammunition. Not as good as the upcoming M93 rounds, not as good as Soviet ammunition, but better than what tankers had yesterday. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, better than yesterday meant some crews lived who otherwise would have died. By September 1944, field-modified ammunition was being quietly distributed to tank platoons across the First Army. No official documentation acknowledged its existence. No supply records tracked it. But Sherman crews knew which rounds had been improved, and they saved them for engagements with German heavy armor. The official analysis of Soviet armor-piercing ammunition conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground between August and October 1944 revealed metallurgical principles that reshaped American ammunition design for the remainder of the war and beyond. The Soviet 76.2 mm BR-350A armor-piercing round used a penetrator core made from steel alloyed with approximately 1.5% chromium and 3.5% nickel, hardened through heat treatment to approximately Rockwell C4248. American M61 rounds, by contrast, used medium carbon steel hardened only to Rockwell C3035. The difference was profound. When a penetrator strikes face-hardened armor, the impact generates extreme localized stress. Softer penetrators deform, mushroom, or shatter. Harder penetrators retain their geometry and concentrate force into a smaller area, allowing them to crack and penetrate the armor. The Soviet rounds' superior hardness meant they punched through armor that stopped American rounds of similar diameter and velocity. Additionally, Soviet rounds featured better aerodynamics. The sharper ogive and better ballistic coefficient meant they retained velocity more effectively at range. At 1,000 yards, Soviet 76.2 mm rounds struck with approximately 12% more kinetic energy than American 75 mm rounds, despite similar muzzle velocities. That extra energy translated directly to penetration depth. Colonel Henry Thompson, chief of the Ordnance Technical Division, summarized the findings in a September 12th report. Soviet ammunition design demonstrates superior understanding of armor penetration mechanics. Their metallurgical approach, while not revolutionary, is significantly ahead of current U.S. practice. Immediate adoption of similar specifications is recommended for all future armor-piercing round production. The Army responded quickly. The M93 armor-piercing round, entering production in October 1944, incorporated the Soviet metallurgical approach. Later testing showed that M93 rounds penetrated approximately 25% more armor than M61 rounds at comparable ranges, bringing the Sherman's 75 mm gun's performance much closer to adequate against German heavy armor. But production timelines meant M93 rounds didn't reach frontline units in significant quantities until early 1945. For the fighting in France, Belgium, and Western Germany in late 1944, American tankers still relied on either obsolete M61 ammunition or the field-modified rounds that ordnance units were quietly producing. The psychological impact of understanding why American ammunition had failed was as important as the technical improvements. Tankers who'd believed their weapons were simply useless now understood that the problem was specific and solvable. They weren't helpless. They were using inadequate ammunition, and better ammunition was coming. This knowledge shifted tactical thinking. Training bulletins issued in October 1944 emphasized that engaging German heavy armor remained dangerous but not suicidal. Crews were taught to maximize their advantages: numbers, mobility, combined arms coordination, while minimizing exposure to enemy guns. The defeatism that had characterized some units in July gave way to calculated aggression. German intelligence noted the change. Interrogation reports from captured panzer crews in late Ts. 1944 mentioned that American tank fire had become noticeably more effective. Panthers were being penetrated at ranges where they'd previously been immune. German ordnance officers, analyzing recovered American ammunition, identified the metallurgical changes and issued warnings about improved enemy armor-piercing rounds. The irony was complete. German intelligence had captured Soviet T-34s and studied their ammunition years earlier. They understood Soviet metallurgy. But they'd never shared that intelligence with their American opponents. Now, by abandoning equipment during retreats, they'd inadvertently given American ordnance officers the physical samples they needed to close the ammunition quality gap. By November 1944, the U.S. Army had not only matched Soviet armor-piercing round performance, but had begun exceeding it. The M93 round, combined with the new 76mm M1 gun being mounted on Sherman variants, gave American tankers a weapon system capable of fighting German heavy armor on more equal terms. Soviet scrap metal, dismissed and ignored for years, had become the foundation for American ammunition superiority. Technical Sergeant Frank Martinez received the Bronze Star in November 1944 for exceptional initiative and technical expertise, contributing to improved armored combat effectiveness. The citation didn't mention Soviet ammunition, field modifications, or unauthorized metallurgical experiments. It praised his dedication to supporting frontline units through innovative maintenance procedures. Martinez survived the war. He returned to El Paso, took over his father's machine shop, and rarely spoke about his role in revolutionizing American tank ammunition. He died in 1983, largely unknown outside the small community of 3rd Armored Division veterans who credited his observations with saving their lives. The M93 armor-piercing round and its successors, the T4 and eventually the M82, became standard U.S. ammunition for the remainder of World War II and into the Korean conflict. Post-war analysis estimated that the improved penetration performance of these rounds increased American tank survivability in engagements with German heavy armor by approximately 30%. If casualty rates from July 1944 had continued through the remainder of the European campaign, American armored divisions would have suffered an additional 400 to 600 tank losses and 2,000 to 3,000 crew casualties. The broader lesson, that Allied nations' technical approaches contained valuable insights, reshaped American military technical intelligence practices. After 1944, the U.S. established formal programs for evaluating Soviet and British weapons and ammunition, leading to cross-adoption of numerous technologies. The post-war M26 Pershing tank incorporated design elements from Soviet, British, and German sources. American Cold War armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot, APFSDS, rounds traced their conceptual lineage directly to British, innovations that American ordnance officers had finally begun studying seriously in 1944. The field modification efforts, the unauthorized heat treating of the penetrator cores, remained officially unacknowledged for decades. Army regulations technically prohibited field units from altering ammunition. But post-war interviews with ordnance officers revealed that the practice was widespread and tacitly approved by division commanders who prioritized effectiveness over regulatory compliance. In 1947, The Army revised its field modification regulations to formally allow controlled experimentation with ammunition improvements when approved by theater-level ordnance commands. German forces never developed effective countermeasures to the improved American ammunition. By the time M93 rounds reached frontline units in significant quantities, German armored forces were already depleted and increasingly immobilized by fuel shortages. The brief window where German heavy armor enjoyed overwhelming technical superiority had closed. American tankers still faced dangerous opponents, but the gross imbalance of mid-1944 never returned. Soviet forces, meanwhile, remained largely unaware that their abandoned ammunition had revolutionized American ordnance design. Post-war Soviet technical intelligence focused on German innovations, particularly in shaped charge warheads and fire control systems. The irony that Soviet metallurgy had saved American lives while Soviet and American forces never directly cooperated on ammunition development remained unknown to Soviet engineers until decades later. Today, the M4 Sherman is remembered as an adequate but outmatched tank that succeeded through numbers rather than technical superiority. That assessment, while partially true, overlooks the ammunition revolution of 1944. The Sherman remained the same, but what it fired and how American crews used it changed fundamentally. Sometimes the tank isn't the weakness. Sometimes it's what you load into the gun. Wars are won not just by superior technology, but by the willingness to learn from anyone, including unexpected sources. The American armored forces of 1944 entered Normandy with obsolete ammunition because institutional processes moved slowly and procurement priorities lagged behind battlefield realities. They could have continued suffering catastrophic losses while waiting for official solutions. Instead, maintenance sergeants and field ordnance officers did what effective militaries have always done. They observed, adapted, and improvised. They looked at abandoned enemy equipment, studied ammunition from an ally they'd never fought alongside, and asked why Soviet metallurgy worked better than their own. Then they applied those lessons immediately. Regulations be damned. The Russian scrap, scattered across French battlefields, wasn't treasure because it was exotic or advanced. It was treasure because it answered a question American tankers desperately needed answered. How do we make our weapons work against an enemy who's killing us? Technical Sergeant Martinez, standing in that maintenance depot in July 1944, holding a Soviet shell casing, made a choice. He could dismiss it as foreign, incompatible, irrelevant, or he could ask what it taught. That curiosity, that willingness to learn from anything that worked, regardless of source, saved hundreds of American lives. It changed ammunition design for generations. And it demonstrated that in war, as in life, the most dangerous assumption is that your way is the only way. Sometimes the best ideas come wrapped in Cyrillic letters and stamped enemy use. Sometimes you just need to be smart enough to read them. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.